James Laxton, cinematographer for the Underground Railroad. Barry Jenkins' new Amazon series based on the book by Colson Whitehead. A young woman named Cora makes an amazing discovery during her attempt to break free from slavery in the Deep South. James, your relationship with Barry goes back to college. You've obviously worked on his 3 feature films and stuff. What were your first conversations with him about the Underground Railroad like? And like, what were they? Yeah, basically.
Yeah. I mean, they start pretty loose, I'd say, and that's true for our past projects as well, just kind of shaping the project in general. I think our first kind of like concepts were largely about how to portray sort of 2 things at once. One is the sort of the truth telling of what, our history as Americans, and what this book talks about is of obviously of the slavery era. At the same time, mixing this sort of the mythological sort of element of the telling of this version of our past, which of course, if you read the book and if you'll see the show, is that instead of the Underground Railroad being sort of a pathway of sorts, this time in the sort of symbology of a real train and steam engine running underneath the ground in the south of America going northward. So it was sort of trying to sort of square those 2 things, not dipping too far into the fantastical because we want to ground ourselves in a real truth-telling exercise here. Yet at the same time, clearly, as you read the book and as we hope we portrayed in the show, there's a really vast scope and a really massive journey that Cora is on. So it was sort of, the first discussions were largely about how to sort of do both those things at the same time.
Can you talk a little about like the visualizing of the actual Underground Railroad? Like you said, that's a big part of it. I think that's one of the things that separates it certainly from like stories about slavery that we've seen in the past. I guess, can you talk a little about like that visualization and like how you guys came to how you ended up doing it?
So it's interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, the big thing for Barry, and the thing he drummed into all of his department heads earlier on, was he wanted to cut as little as possible, meaning he wanted to see, real actors interact with real trains all in one shot, or at the very least be able to sort of see them move and interact in the same shot, not to rely on some sort of camera trickery or some visual effect or CGI element. So that was our big task. So how to figure that out is tricky. And so what we ended up doing was building an entire tunnel, a physical tunnel, about 150 foot, maybe 200 foot long tunnel around trains that existed in reality. It's a steam, there's a train museum in Savannah, Georgia, that was kind enough to allow us to sort of take over their facility for a few weeks. And Mark Freeberg, our fantastic production designer, built this massive, he alone with sticks and stones. No, his entire crew built this massive train tunnel, which was fantastic. And we, had to rig it with all kinds of LED lighting to light our sort of darkness sets and allow for some of these scenes that Cora, walks down in with a candle, let's say, for example, and a lot of rigging went into all that stuff. So it was a big undertaking. But the basis for that was to sort of allow Barry to really explore the spaces for real. Because again, going back to that first thing I said a moment ago, it was really critical for us to not dip into the fantastical, and it was wanting to see real people, interact with real trains, which is what we ended up doing. Obviously, it was lovely. And what a great opportunity it was to have that museum sort of in the state of Georgia where we knew we were going to shoot. It just felt serendipitous and perfect for us.
Yeah, it's certainly like the weight of the trains is so apparent when you're watching it. It just feels like they're massive and physically there. And it's just, I don't think you can replicate that with visual effects at all.
I didn't realize how big these trains were, to be perfectly honest, until I started this project. They're enormous.
Yeah, they are.
It's an amazing feat of engineering that these things actually move.
The other thing that I found, that separates the show, I think, is that, and I think Barry's talked about this, is that, I think you're not shying away from showing the trauma and the violence and the brutality, but I think the way the show presents that is you're really centering the humanity of the characters. And I guess visually, can you talk about how you guys, discuss how you would approach that and how you ended up executing that?
You're touching on a topic that we discussed, quite a lot about, as you might imagine. It was really important for us not to be gratuitous or to dip into the violence with too heavy-handedly. And you also touch on what I think our goal was, which was to instead root the camera perspective to particular characters, our main characters, let's say, and see and witness sort of the trauma through their eyes, as opposed to, for example, to cutting to the whip and cutting to the impact and cutting to the grimace. And instead, what we wanted to do was sort of watch it from a character's perspective. So a great example of that is in the first episode where one of our main characters and a young boy are being tied up and whipped, and we start very, very wide, to sort of just see the sort of setup in the infrastructure, which is another whole idea that we can talk about at some point, maybe, but that of slavery, but just sort of the infrastructure of what was about to happen. And instead of, we sort of start to drift downwards and push in a little bit, but instead of going towards the violence, we almost immediately start panning left, and we find our one of our main characters, Caesar, and that's the scene. It's one shot instead of, like I said, cutting to all these inserts that would felt like it would be, dipping into sort of some terrible gratuitousness. It just felt like we needed to be rooted to character instead.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. I know that you guys had like counselors maybe on set to talk about like, doing these, recreating these, these terrible traumatic things. I guess for you as cinematographer, like, can you talk a little about that? Like the challenge of having to actually capture these images, but also like like you have obviously humanity yourself. So like, how is that for you? Like to do that, and like, how did this shoot affect you, I guess, on that level?
As you might imagine, massively. It took a lot of emotional strength to get through a lot of days. It was, a daily occurrence. I mean, most days something, terrible was happening. And even if it wasn't physical, it was mental or it was spiritual. There's something was happening that was just really challenging material. So it wore on you. And there are days where you got through it easily and days where you didn't. But as you say, Amazon was kind enough to make sure the crew and the cast were taken care of. So there was a counselor on set, for most of the really traumatic scenes. I'm sorry, all of the traumatic scenes and maybe some more. Just so people could step away and have a discussion about what they were feeling like. And a lot of people employed that, obviously for great reason. So it was tough. And to be a cinematographer within that is it was a bizarre experience, because you're experiencing these things because you want to feel them. It's important to process that as an artist capturing what you're capturing. You need to interact and engage with your characters as much as actors and cast in general. And so what was tricky as well was, sort of walking up to these people, who are experiencing and going through a very traumatic time performing these scenes, and say, hey, I'm sorry, but can you step a little bit to your left, or can you back up a step? I mean, it was just sort of mind-boggling having to sort of like continuously, do your job while for good reason, trying to make sure you're engaged with the material. I can talk about that forever. It was not easy. Yeah.
No, I can imagine it. It's not. I mean, this is, this is certainly, I would argue, the biggest project you guys have done together, like scope wise and scale wise. And I mean, like there's like a lot of different genres or, kind of within this, right? Like in episode 9, there's the big siege on the Valentine farm and stuff. It's just like a huge, it's not an action show, but that's like a huge action set piece. I guess, can you talk about that, like being able to do that, or like how you guys kind of like worked on that, and that specifically, I think that sequence is really incredible. That whole episode is incredible, but I think that sequence is really great too. And I just, like, how did you guys kind of frame that out, and like going from the church into like the surrounding area of the farm and stuff, or, I just think that was really great.
There was a few scenes in the show that we storyboarded, and that was one of them. We scheduled accordingly as well. And so that particular sequence we shot over a few days, which was a luxury. I don't know if we've ever shot a scene, let alone a sequence, over that many days. So anyway, that was storyboarded along with a few other complicated scenes in the show. Largely speaking, Bear and I don't do that. And so we sort of realized we needed to sort of go through a different process for that particular sequence because it just needed so much planning. You know, not necessarily for our visual interests, but more so just to sort of be able to communicate with different departments about what needed to be ready in frame and which way we were looking for what part of the sequence. You know, Barry and I quite like to be a little looser than that, generally creatively. But that sequence, along with, like I said, with a few others, we storyboarded and plotted out more specifically.
James Laxton, thanks so much. Underground Railroad on Amazon. Stick around. We're going to do the group roundtable here shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much.